Hi, I'm Riley. 3 months ago, my sister created a GoFundMe campaign titled Help Our Struggling Sister Get Back on Her Feet, with a photo of me from 5 years ago, when I was genuinely broke and working 3 part-time jobs. What they didn't mention was that I've been married to Pentagon Chief of Strategic Operations Colonel Marcus Webb for the past 4 years, living in a beautiful townhouse in Arlington, Virginia. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Yesterday morning, I woke up to see that someone had donated $50 million to their campaign. The donor name read, Anonymous Supporter. But I recognized the donation immediately because it came with a very specific message that only one person in the world would know to write. My husband had just exposed everything using my real married name, Riley Webb, complete with our Arlington address as the billing information. The same address my family had been told not to contact me at years ago when they decided I was too much trouble to keep around. The first sign that something was deeply wrong in the Patterson household wasn't dramatic. It was the silence that followed whenever I walked into a room where my family was having an animated conversation. You know that particular quiet that drops like a curtain when someone unwelcome appears? That was my soundtrack growing up in our ranch house on Maple Street in Riverside, Oregon. My sister Brooke had always been the constellation around which our family orbited. 2 years younger than me, but infinitely more magnetic, she possessed that effortless charm that made adults lean in when she spoke and made other kids want to sit beside her at lunch. Her laugh carried through walls, bright and musical, the kind of sound that made people smile reflexively even if they hadn't heard the joke. I, on the other hand, had mastered the art of occupying the smallest possible space in any given room. Growing up, our house felt like a stage set designed for a 3-person family, with me as the perpetual understudy who never quite fit the production. Brooke commanded the living room with her dance rehearsals, her voice lesson practice, her endless stream of friends who treated our kitchen like their personal hangout spot. My parents, Linda and Frank, buzzed around her like devoted stage managers, coordinating carpools to auditions, discussing her college prospects, planning her future with the kind of investment usually reserved for hedge funds. I learned early that interrupting these planning sessions was like stepping into a choreographed dance, where everyone knew the steps except me. They'd pause, offer a polite smile, maybe ask if I needed something, then seamlessly return to their Brooke-centered universe once I retreated to my room. My academic achievements hung on the refrigerator for exactly 1 week before being replaced by Brooke's latest artistic accomplishment. My acceptance letter to Oregon State got a congratulatory dinner at Applebee's. Brooke's acceptance to Northwestern University got a celebration party that filled our backyard with neighbors and extended family. The most insidious part wasn't the obvious favoritism, though. It was how they'd trained me to accept it as natural, reasonable even. When I questioned why Brooke got a car for her 16th birthday while I got a promise that I could borrow theirs sometimes, Linda explained that Brooke needed reliable transportation for her various commitments. When I asked why my part-time job earnings went toward my own school supplies while Brooke's allowance remained untouched, Frank reminded me that responsibility builds character. They'd perfected the art of making their neglect sound like parenting strategy. College became my escape hatch, though even that felt bittersweet. While Brooke headed off to Northwestern with a care package that could have sustained a small village, and parents who drove the 8 hours to visit her monthly, I loaded my belongings into 2 suitcases and took a Greyhound bus to Corvallis. My parents dropped me at the bus station with a hug and a reminder to call if I really needed anything, though their tone suggested they hoped those calls would be infrequent. Oregon State University was where I first experienced what it felt like to be seen. Not as Brooke's older sister, not as the quiet one, not as the responsible child who required less attention, but as Riley Patterson, a person with her own thoughts, ambitions, and potential. I threw myself into my international relations coursework with the hunger of someone who'd been intellectually starving. Professors remembered my name, referenced my papers in class discussions, encouraged me to pursue graduate work. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was taking up the right amount of space in the world. The summer between my junior and senior year, I landed an internship with a nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C., that focused on veterans affairs. The work was meaningful but poorly paid, requiring me to share a cramped studio apartment with 2 other interns, and survive on a diet that consisted primarily of ramen noodles and whatever free food appeared at organizational events. When I called home to share my excitement about the work I was doing, research that might actually influence policy decisions affecting thousands of veterans, Linda's response was measured concern about my finances and gentle suggestions that maybe I should consider something more practical, more stable. Meanwhile, every conversation seemed to circle back to Brooke's latest triumph. She'd booked a small role in a student film that was being screened at a regional festival. She'd been selected for a summer intensive program in New York that would require additional financial support from home, naturally. She was considering changing her major to something more creative, which Frank assured me they fully supported because following your passion was what college was really about. It was during that internship summer that I met Marcus Webb. He was Lieutenant Colonel Webb then, giving a briefing to our organization about military mental health initiatives. Afterward, he lingered to answer additional questions, and I found myself staying late, drawn into a conversation about the gaps between policy intention and implementation reality. He was unlike anyone I'd encountered, combining sharp intellectual curiosity with a groundedness that felt like gravity in a world that often seemed to spin without direction. Marcus had grown up in a military family, moving frequently, learning to adapt quickly to new environments, while maintaining a strong sense of his core values. He understood what it meant to feel like an outsider, to constantly prove yourself worthy of the space you occupied. When he talked about his work, his commitment to serving something larger than himself, I recognized a seriousness of purpose that resonated with something deep in my own chest. Our relationship developed slowly, carefully, built on long conversations over coffee that stretched into dinner, weekend walks through D.C., neighborhoods where we'd discover bookstores and museums and talk about everything from foreign policy to our favorite childhood books. Marcus never made me feel like I was taking up too much space or asking for too much attention. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts, my plans, my dreams that extended far beyond being someone's sister or daughter. When I returned to Oregon State for my senior year, we maintained our connection through daily phone calls and weekend visits when his schedule permitted. My family knew I was dating someone in D.C., but they seemed to view it as a phase, a temporary distraction before I settled into whatever practical career path they'd vaguely imagined for me. They never asked his name, never inquired about his work, never expressed interest in meeting him. He remained Riley's friend from her internship, a footnote in conversations that quickly returned to more important topics. Marcus proposed during my graduation weekend, a quiet moment in the hotel garden where he'd been staying to attend the ceremony. My parents had driven down for the graduation, their first visit to my campus in 4 years, and were staying in a different hotel because they'd planned to spend most of the weekend visiting Brooke in Chicago on their way home. The proposal was everything I'd hoped for, romantic and thoughtful, and perfectly suited to who we were as a couple. When I shared the news with my family over dinner that night, their reaction was polite congratulations, followed immediately by questions about timing. Would this affect my job search? Had I considered how challenging military life could be for spouses? Was I sure I was ready for such a serious commitment at my age? Brooke, who had driven down from Chicago to attend my graduation, offered a hug and a comment about how military weddings could be really beautiful if done right, then launched into a detailed description of a destination wedding she'd recently attended in Cabo. The wedding planning process crystallized everything I'd always known but never fully articulated about my place in the Patterson family hierarchy. Linda offered to help with arrangements but seemed perpetually distracted, frequently mentioning how busy she was with Brooke's senior year preparations and graduate school applications. Frank contributed financially, but with the air of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than celebrating a joy. When I showed them the chapel Marcus had found on base for the ceremony, beautiful and meaningful to both of us, Linda suggested that maybe something more traditional would photograph better for the family albums. We kept the wedding small and elegant, surrounded by Marcus's military colleagues and the few college friends who could make the trip to Virginia. My family attended, dressed appropriately and behaving politely, but they seemed like visitors to someone else's celebration rather than central participants in their daughter's wedding. During the reception, I watched Linda and Frank make conversation with Marcus's parents, retired Colonel David Webb and his wife Catherine, who had driven down from Maryland and immediately embraced me as the daughter they'd always hoped Marcus would find. The contrast was striking and painful. The Webb family asked detailed questions about my work, my interests, my plans for the future. They remembered stories I'd told months earlier and referenced them in new conversations. Catherine insisted on exchanging phone numbers so we could stay in regular contact, and when she said it, I believed she meant it. Meanwhile, my own parents spent most of the reception checking their phones and discussing their early morning flight home, where they needed to help Brooke prepare for graduate school interviews. After the wedding, Marcus and I settled into our life in Arlington, a beautiful townhouse in a quiet neighborhood where many of his Pentagon colleagues lived with their families. Marcus was climbing rapidly through the ranks, his combination of strategic thinking and diplomatic skills making him invaluable in complex international negotiations. I found work with a consulting firm that specialized in government relations, applying my international relations background to help organizations navigate federal agencies and policy decisions. For the first time in my adult life, I was building something that belonged entirely to me. Marcus and I traveled when his schedule permitted, exploring national parks and historic cities.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Creating photo albums full of memories that no one could diminish or overshadow. We hosted dinner parties where I was the co-host, not the helpful sister in the background. We made friends who knew me as Riley Webb, accomplished professional and beloved wife, not as Brooke's quieter older sister who'd somehow managed to land on her feet. The distance from Riverside felt healthy, necessary even. Phone calls with my parents became monthly check-ins that lasted 15 minutes and covered weather, work generalities, and Brooke's latest achievements. They never asked to visit our new home, never expressed interest in meeting our friends, never inquired about Marcus's career beyond polite acknowledgement that he seemed to be doing well. When Marcus was promoted to colonel and assigned as Chief of Strategic Operations, a position that put him among the youngest senior officers at the Pentagon, my parents' response was a brief congratulations card that arrived 2 weeks after I'd shared the news. Brooke, meanwhile, had graduated from Northwestern and moved to Los Angeles to pursue acting. Her social media presence became a carefully curated showcase of auditions, headshots, networking events, and the glamorous struggle of artistic pursuit. Linda and Frank followed her journey with the devotion of sports fans tracking their favorite team's season, discussing her prospects, analyzing her opportunities, celebrating every callback, and commiserating over every rejection. During our last conversation before everything changed, Linda spent 20 minutes detailing Brooke's latest near miss with a television pilot, complete with analysis of what had gone wrong and strategies for improvement. When I mentioned that Marcus and I were considering starting a family soon, her response was brief acknowledgement, followed by a reminder that Brooke was considering moving back to Chicago if the LA market didn't improve, and wasn't it nice that she had options? The emotional archaeology of that conversation would haunt me later, not because of what was said, but because of what I finally heard in the silence underneath it. My life, my marriage, my potential future children, they were footnotes in a story that had never really included me as a main character. I was the supporting player who'd somehow wandered into her own separate movie, and they were still waiting for me to return to my designated role in their original production. That realization should have been devastating. Instead, it felt oddly liberating. For years, I'd been trying to earn my way into the center of their attention, believing that if I just achieved enough, succeeded enough, became enough, they'd finally see me as worth their full consideration. But sitting in my beautiful Arlington kitchen, surrounded by the life Marcus and I had built together, I understood that their vision of me had nothing to do with who I actually was or what I'd actually accomplished. The irony was that I'd finally become someone worth celebrating. My work was challenging and impactful, contributing to policy decisions that affected thousands of people. My marriage was strong and partnership-based, built on mutual respect and shared values. My husband was a distinguished military officer whose colleagues sought his counsel on complex international matters. My life was full and meaningful and successful by any reasonable metric. But success, I was beginning to understand, wasn't going to change the fundamental dynamic that had been established decades earlier. I could cure cancer, and they'd probably mention it briefly, before returning to their detailed analysis of Brooke's latest audition. I could win a Nobel Prize, and they'd frame the newspaper clipping right next to Brooke's latest headshot. The recognition was both heartbreaking and freeing. Heartbreaking because it meant accepting that the family approval I'd spent my entire life pursuing was never going to materialize in the way I'd imagined. Freeing because it meant I could stop contorting myself to fit into a space that had never been designed to accommodate who I actually was. Marcus, with his military background and understanding of complex family dynamics, helped me process this realization without bitterness. He'd grown up watching talented soldiers struggle with commanding officers who would never recognize their contributions, regardless of their performance. He understood that some battles couldn't be won through excellence alone, that sometimes the most strategic response was to stop fighting for territory that would never be ceded. Together, we began building holiday traditions that belonged to us, creating celebrations with his family and our chosen friends that felt warm and inclusive and genuinely joyful. We sent appropriate gifts and cards to my family for birthdays and holidays, maintaining the surface-level courtesies that kept relationships functional without investing emotional energy in outcomes we couldn't control. I thought I'd found peace with the situation. I thought I'd successfully navigated the transition from seeking their approval to simply maintaining civilized distance. I thought the hardest part was behind us. I had no idea that the real test was still coming, that they were about to demonstrate just how little they understood about who I'd become or what my life actually looked like. I had no idea that their next move would be so publicly humiliating, so fundamentally insulting, that it would force me to choose between protecting their feelings and protecting my own dignity. And I definitely had no idea that Marcus was about to respond in a way that would change everything, not just for our family dynamics, but for their entire understanding of who they'd been dismissing all these years. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in our Arlington home. Marcus had left early for a Pentagon briefing, kissing me goodbye in the pre-dawn darkness while I mumbled something about having coffee ready when he returned. I was reviewing quarterly reports for my consulting firm when my phone buzzed with a notification I'd been dreading for months. Chloe Reeves, my college roommate who still lived in Portland, had sent me a screenshot with a message that made my stomach drop to my knees. "Riley, please tell me this isn't what I think it is." The image showed a GoFundMe campaign page titled, "Help Our Struggling Sister Get Back on Her Feet." The featured photo was unmistakably me, but it was a version of myself I'd tried to forget. Taken during my senior year of college when I was working 3 part-time jobs to afford textbooks, I looked exhausted, thin, wearing a thrift store sweater that had seen better days. My hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and my smile looked forced, the kind you manufacture when someone insists on taking a photo during your worst moments. But it wasn't just the photo that made my hands shake as I held my phone. It was the description underneath, written in Brooke's unmistakably dramatic voice, painting a picture of a sister who'd fallen on such hard times that her family was forced to reach out to strangers for help. "Our beloved sister Riley has always been the responsible one in our family," the description began. "But sometimes life throws curveballs that even the most prepared person can't handle. After a series of job losses and financial setbacks, Riley is struggling to make ends meet. She's too proud to ask for help herself, but as her family, we can't stand by and watch her suffer in silence." The description continued for several paragraphs, each sentence a masterclass in emotional manipulation disguised as family concern. They'd crafted a narrative where I was the tragic figure who'd never quite managed to find her footing after college, bouncing between temporary positions, living paycheck to paycheck, too embarrassed to admit to my successful younger sister that I needed assistance. "Riley has always put everyone else's needs before her own," Brooke had written, "and now it's time for us to put her first. Any contribution, no matter how small, will help her get back on her feet and start rebuilding her life. She deserves the chance to find stability and happiness, and with your help, we can make that possible." The funding goal was set at $25,000. In the 3 days since the campaign had been posted, they'd already raised nearly $8,000 from family friends, former neighbors, people from our church, and strangers who'd been moved by the story of a struggling young woman whose family was trying to help her find her way. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life I'd actually built, staring at this alternate reality version of myself that my family had created and published for the world to see. The marble countertops Marcus and I had selected together gleamed in the morning sunlight. The coffee maker he'd given me for our anniversary gurgled contentedly in the background. Through the window I could see our neighbor walking her golden retriever past the small garden, where I'd planted herbs and flowers that were finally beginning to bloom. My phone rang, interrupting the surreal moment of seeing my fictional poverty displayed like a museum exhibit. Chloe's name appeared on the screen, and I answered without thinking. "Riley, what the hell is going on?" Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd been worrying for hours. "Please tell me this is some kind of mistake or misunderstanding, because I've been staring at this thing all night and I cannot figure out how to make it make sense." I found my voice, though it sounded strange and distant even to me. "It's not a mistake. They actually did this. They posted a GoFundMe claiming you're broke and struggling when you're married to a Pentagon colonel and living in a house that probably costs more than my annual salary." That about sums it up. Chloe was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her moving around her apartment, probably pacing the way she did when she was trying to process something particularly absurd. "Riley, this is insane. Like, genuinely unhinged behavior. Do they not know you're married? Do they not know what Marcus does for a living?" That was the question that had been haunting me since I'd seen the screenshot. How much did they actually know about my life, and how much had they simply chosen to ignore or forget? They know I'm married. They came to the wedding. They have our address. They've gotten Christmas cards from both of us for 4 years. Then they know Marcus is military. They know he works at the Pentagon. I'm not sure they've ever bothered to ask exactly what that means, or what rank he holds. Chloe made a sound that was half laugh, half outrage. "So they just decided to create an alternate reality where you're some kind of charity case who needs crowdfunding to survive. Apparently. And they used a photo from college, when you were actually struggling, to make it more convincing. They probably figured it was the most recent picture they had of me looking appropriately pathetic." The bitterness in my voice surprised me. I'd thought I'd moved past feeling hurt by my family's dismissal, but seeing it broadcast to hundreds of strangers felt like a violation I hadn't prepared for. They hadn't just ignored my success, they'd actively erased it, substituting their preferred narrative of who I was supposed to be. "What are you going to do?" Chloe asked. "I have no idea. Part of me wants to call them and demand they take it down immediately. Part of me wants to ignore it completely and let them deal with the consequences when people figure out the truth. And part of me wants to donate to my own GoFundMe, just to see how they explain that. You should call Marcus first. He's in meetings all morning. Some crisis situation that's had him working 16-hour days for the past week." "Riley, this is a crisis situation too. Your family just publicly humiliated you and potentially damaged your professional reputation. What if your clients see this? What if Marcus's colleagues see it? What if someone at the Pentagon starts asking questions about why the chief of strategic operations is married to someone who apparently needs public assistance?" The implications I'd been trying not to think about crashed over me like a cold wave. My consulting firm worked with government agencies. My reputation for professionalism and discretion was the foundation of my career. If clients started questioning my financial stability or wondered whether I might be a security risk due to money problems, it could destroy everything I'd built. "I need to document this before they have a chance to delete it," I said, already taking screenshots of every page, every comment, every detail of the campaign. "Good thinking. And Riley? When you do talk to Marcus, remember that this isn't your fault. You didn't ask for this. You didn't deserve this. And whatever you decide to do about it, you have every right to be furious." After we hung up, I spent the next hour methodically documenting everything. Screenshots of the main campaign page, the description, the donor list, the comments from well-meaning strangers offering encouragement and sharing their own stories of financial hardship. I saved it all to a folder on my computer, then printed copies and stored them in a file folder, treating it like the legal evidence it might eventually become. The comments were almost worse than the campaign itself. Strangers offering prayers for my situation, sharing advice about budgeting and job hunting, expressing sympathy for how hard it must be to struggle while watching a younger sister succeed in her chosen field. Several people mentioned that they'd been in similar situations and understood how difficult it could be to ask family for help. One comment, from someone named Janet Morrison, who appeared to be a family friend, particularly stung. Riley was always such a sweet girl, but she never seemed to find her direction after college. It's wonderful that Brooke and your parents are stepping up to help her during this difficult time. Family is everything. Another, from someone I didn't recognize. This is so heartbreaking. You can tell from the photo how much she's struggling. Thank you for sharing her story and giving us the chance to help. They weren't just donating money to a fictional version of my life. They were actively participating in the narrative that I was a failure who needed rescue. Every contribution reinforced the story my family had decided to tell about who I was and what my life looked like. My phone rang again, this time showing my mother's number. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out over caution. Riley, honey, I hope you're doing well. Linda's voice carried that particular tone she used when she was trying to sound caring, but wasn't quite sure how to execute it convincingly. I was calling because we wanted to let you know about something we're doing to help you out. The audacity was breathtaking. She was calling to inform me about the GoFundMe, as if it were a surprise gift rather than a public humiliation orchestrated without my knowledge or consent. I saw it, I said simply. There was a pause, and I could hear her recalibrating her approach. Oh, well, good. We were hoping you wouldn't be upset. We know how independent you are, but sometimes family has to step in even when you're too proud to ask for help. Mom, I don't need help. I haven't needed help for years. Honey, I know it's hard to admit when things aren't going well, but there's no shame in accepting support from people who love you. The disconnect was so complete that I wondered if we were having the same conversation. Do you know what Marcus does for a living? He works for the government, doesn't he? Something military related. He's a colonel in the United States Army. He's the chief of strategic operations at the Pentagon. We live in a 4-bedroom townhouse in Arlington that's worth more than you paid for your house in Riverside. Silence stretched between us, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Linda spoke, her voice smaller than before. Well, that's wonderful, dear. I'm sure you're both doing fine. Then why did you create a fundraising campaign claiming I'm struggling financially? We just thought, well, military families sometimes have challenges that outsiders don't understand. And you never really talk about your situation when we call. Because you never ask about my situation when you call. You spend the entire conversation talking about Brooke. Another pause, this one carrying a weight that felt different than simple confusion. Riley, I think you might be exaggerating how little attention we pay to your life. Mom, when's the last time you asked about my work? We ask about your work all the time. When's the last time you asked Marcus about his promotion? I'm sure we've discussed his career. What's the name of my consulting firm? Silence. What neighborhood do I live in? More silence. Have you ever asked for our home address so you could send us anything besides a Christmas card? Riley, I don't think this is fair. As evening fell and the Marines completed their work, Derek and I found ourselves alone in our restored kitchen. The cleaning service had worked miracles, and while the nursery remained unusable, the rest of our house was beginning to feel like home again. Your father scares me a little, I admitted to Derek as we shared a quiet dinner. But I'm grateful he's on our side. Derek smiled for the first time since we'd received Vanessa's photo. Dad doesn't just command Marines, Nat. He protects families. And now you and Isabella are his family, too. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and my stomach clenched with anxiety. But when I opened it, I found a message that made tears spring to my eyes. Mrs. Winters, this is Sergeant Martinez. On behalf of the Marines who secured your home today, we want you to know that Isabella Rose has the protection of the United States Marine Corps. No one threatens a Marine family on our watch. Semper Fi. I showed the message to Derek and watched as his eyes filled with pride and emotion. That's my family, he said quietly. That's who we are now. Looking down at Isabella sleeping peacefully in her temporary bassinet, I realized that Vanessa's attack had backfired in ways she could never have anticipated. Instead of isolating us or breaking our spirits, she had activated a network of protection and support that she couldn't have imagined in her worst nightmares. The woman who had destroyed our nursery while I gave birth was about to discover that she hadn't just attacked Natalie and Derek Winters. She had attacked a Marine family, and that was an entirely different kind of enemy to make. 3 days after coming home from the hospital, I was feeding Isabella in our temporary nursery setup when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The caller ID showed a Phoenix area code, and my heart sank. I had been dreading this conversation since Detective Hayes filed her report. "Hello, Natalie." My mother's voice was crisp and controlled, the tone she used when she was about to deliver a lecture. "I think we need to talk about this situation with Vanessa." I shifted Isabella to my shoulder, taking comfort in her warm weight against my chest. "Mom, did you see the photos the police sent you? Did you see what she did to our home while I was in labor?" "I saw pictures of a messy house," Patricia said dismissively. "But calling the police on your own sister? Having her arrested?" Then I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and began crafting an email to my business partner, Christine Walsh, explaining the situation and asking her advice on damage control strategies. Christine called me within minutes of receiving the email. "Riley, this is unbelievable. I mean, literally unbelievable. How does someone create a fundraising campaign without checking basic facts about the person they're supposedly helping? Because they never bothered to learn the basic facts in the first place. What does Marcus think about all this? He doesn't know yet. He's been in crisis meetings all week dealing with some international situation. I didn't want to add this to his stress until I figured out how to handle it. Honey, this directly affects his security clearance and professional standing. Pentagon officials can't have family members who appear to be financial risks or who are involved in public controversies. You need to tell him immediately." She was right, of course. I'd been so focused on my own humiliation that I hadn't fully considered how this might affect Marcus's career. Military spouses were expected to maintain certain standards of conduct, and being the subject of a public fundraising campaign definitely fell outside those parameters, regardless of the circumstances. I spent the next hour creating a comprehensive summary of the situation for Marcus, including screenshots, timeline, and my mother's phone call. I saved it all in a document and emailed it to his secure Pentagon address, with a note asking him to call when he had a private moment. He called 20 minutes later. "Riley, what the hell?" His voice carried the controlled tension of someone who just received information that required immediate strategic thinking. "Please tell me this is some kind of elaborate joke." "I wish it were. They actually created a crowdfunding campaign claiming you need money for basic living expenses? $25,000 to help me get back on my feet after a series of job losses and financial setbacks." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "Riley, this could be a serious problem for my clearance review. If the security office sees this, they're going to have questions about why my wife appears to be financially unstable. They're going to want documentation proving that it's false, explanations about family dynamics, assurances that there are no underlying issues they should be concerned about." The reality of what my family had done crashed over me with new weight. They hadn't just embarrassed me personally, they'd potentially jeopardized the career that Marcus had spent 20 years building. They'd created a security concern that could affect his access to classified information and his ability to perform his duties. "What do we do?" I asked. "First, we document everything exactly as you've already done. Then we get ahead of this before someone in the security office stumbles across it accidentally. I'll reach out to our legal team and get advice on the best way to handle this from a professional standpoint." "And from a personal standpoint?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "From a personal standpoint, I'm trying very hard not to drive to Oregon and have a conversation with your family that they would find extremely unpleasant." Despite everything, I almost smiled. Marcus rarely expressed anger directly, but when he did, it was with the measured precision of someone who understood exactly how much force was appropriate for any given situation. "I love you," I said quietly. "I love you too. And Riley, we're going to handle this together, okay? Whatever it takes to fix this mess and protect both of our reputations, we'll figure it out." After we hung up, I sat in my beautiful kitchen surrounded by the evidence of my actual life. And for the first time since seeing that screenshot, I felt like I could breathe properly. Marcus understood the severity of the situation, but he wasn't blaming me for my family's actions. He was treating it as a problem to be solved, rather than a character flaw to be managed. The afternoons stretched ahead of me, filled with phone calls to make, strategies to consider, and damage control measures to implement. But underneath the practical concerns, something else was growing. Not just anger at their presumption, but clarity about what this revealed about their fundamental understanding of who I was and what my life meant to them. They hadn't made a mistake or acted impulsively. They'd made a calculated decision to publicly portray me as someone I wasn't, using information they knew was outdated, ignoring evidence they had about my actual circumstances. This wasn't about helping me. It was about reinforcing their preferred narrative about my place in the family hierarchy. And now, for the first time in my life, I had the resources and support to respond in kind. The first discovery happened by accident. I was searching through old emails, looking for documentation of my graduation announcement to include in the evidence file I was building, when I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. Buried in my spam folder from 8 months ago was an email from Northwestern University's alumni magazine, requesting permission to feature me in their Distinguished Graduates section. The email had been forwarded to my personal account by someone at the magazine who'd been trying to reach me through my family's contact information when my direct email bounced back from an old address. The subject line read, FW, Alumni Feature Request, Riley Patterson Webb, Class of 2019 Spouse Spotlight. I opened the forwarded message with trembling fingers. The original email, sent to my parents' address, explained that Northwestern wanted to feature military spouses who were making significant contributions to their communities. Someone had nominated me based on my consulting work with veterans organizations and my husband's distinguished service record. The magazine was planning a full-page feature that would include professional photos, an interview about my work, and a profile of what they called the power couple making a difference in Washington. The nomination had included details about Marcus's position, our address in Arlington, my consulting firm's name, and a comprehensive overview of the policy work I'd been doing. Someone had clearly done thorough research, providing the magazine with information that painted a complete picture of our professional lives and community involvement. At the bottom of the email, in a smaller font, was a note that the magazine had been unable to reach me directly and was hoping my family could provide current contact information so they could move forward with the feature. The email had been sitting in my spam folder for 8 months. The magazine had never heard back. The feature had never been published. I immediately called Northwestern's alumni office. "Oh yes, the Riley Webb feature," the coordinator said when I explained who I was. "We were so disappointed when that fell through. It would have been a wonderful story to share with our alumni community." "What exactly happened? Why did it fall through?" "Well, we reached out through the family contact information we had on file, but we never received a response. After several weeks of trying, we assumed you weren't interested in participating and moved on to other profiles." "Did anyone respond to your emails at all?" There was a pause while she checked her records. "Actually, yes. Someone did respond on your behalf. Let me see. Yes, here it is. Someone named Linda Patterson responded saying that you were going through some personal difficulties and wouldn't be available for interviews or public features for the foreseeable future." The room seemed to tilt around me. "Did she provide any additional details?" "She mentioned that you were dealing with some financial challenges and career transitions that made this timing inappropriate. She asked that we remove your name from consideration for any future features until further notice." I thanked the coordinator and hung up, then immediately called Marcus at work. "They blocked a major alumni magazine feature," I told him without preamble when he answered. "Northwestern wanted to do a full-page profile about us, about our work, about your career. My mother told them I was having financial difficulties and wasn't available for interviews." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice carrying the careful control he used in high-stakes diplomatic situations. "When did this happen?" 8 months ago. Right around the time I was promoted to senior consultant, and you were taking over the strategic operations position. So at the exact moment when a positive public profile would have been most beneficial for both of our careers, your family actively prevented it from happening. And they never mentioned it to me. Not once. I only found out because the original email ended up in my spam folder somehow. "Riley, This is starting to look like a pattern rather than a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. Marcus was right, and I knew it. This wasn't about them being out of touch with my life or making assumptions based on outdated information. This was about them actively working to maintain a specific narrative about who I was, even when presented with clear evidence to the contrary. That evening, I decided to conduct a more systematic investigation. If they'd intercepted one professional opportunity, there might be others I didn't know about. I started with my consulting firm's website, checking the contact forms and email logs that Christine had access to. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Over the past 2 years, my firm had received at least 6 inquiries asking specifically for my services based on referrals or recommendations. 3 of those inquiries had come from federal agencies looking for consultants, with my specific background in international relations and veterans affairs. 2 had come from nonprofit organizations that wanted to hire me for major projects. 1 had come from a publishing company interested in commissioning a policy analysis book. All 6 inquiries had been responded to by someone claiming to represent me, explaining that I was not available for new projects due to personal circumstances and career changes. The responses had been professional and polite, but they'd effectively killed every opportunity before I'd even known they existed. The email addresses used for these responses traced back to an account that had been set up using my maiden name and my parents' address. Someone had created an entire fake professional identity, specifically for the purpose of intercepting and declining opportunities on my behalf. I called Christine immediately. "Riley, this is beyond inappropriate," she said after I'd explained what I'd discovered. "This is potentially criminal. They've been impersonating you for business purposes, declining contracts and professional opportunities without your knowledge or consent. Can we trace exactly how they gained access to these inquiries? I'm already on it. But Riley, this explains something that's been bothering me for months. Remember how surprised I was that you weren't getting more high-profile referrals? Your reputation in the field is excellent, and with Marcus's position, you should have been fielding constant offers for consulting work. I thought it was just the normal ebb and flow of business. No, honey. Your skills are in high demand. You should have been turning down work, not struggling to find it." The implications were staggering. For 2 years, while I'd been wondering why my career hadn't progressed as quickly as I'd expected, my family had been systematically sabotaging my professional opportunities. Every time someone had tried to offer me a significant project or recognition, they'd intervene to prevent it from reaching me. But the discoveries weren't finished. The next morning, I decided to check our home's mail forwarding records. When we'd moved to Arlington, I'd set up forwarding from my parents' address for anything that might still be directed there. The Postal Service kept records of forwarded mail, and I still had access to the online account. What I found in the logs made me physically nauseous. Over the past 4 years, dozens of pieces of mail addressed to me had been marked as return to sender or recipient unknown instead of being forwarded to my current address. The list included invitations to professional conferences, alumni networking events, government contractor opportunities, and even personal correspondence from friends who still had my old address on file. Among the returned mail was an invitation to speak at a major international relations conference in Washington, an opportunity that would have significantly elevated my professional profile. There was also a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs, asking if I'd be interested in joining an advisory committee for policy development. Most painful of all was a wedding invitation from my college professor who'd become a mentor, someone whose respect meant more to me than almost any professional recognition. All of it had been sent back with notations claiming I no longer lived at that address and no forwarding information was available. All of it had been prevented from reaching me by someone who had access to my parents' mailbox and the authority to make decisions about my correspondence. I printed every page of the mail logs, adding them to the growing file of evidence that painted a picture of systematic interference with my personal and professional life. This wasn't about them being out of touch or making innocent mistakes. This was about them actively working to isolate me from opportunities and relationships that might contradict their preferred narrative about my life. That afternoon, I called the one person I knew who might be able to provide insight into the family dynamics I'd never fully understood. Mrs. Helen Garcia had been our next-door neighbor in Riverside for over 20 years, a retired teacher who'd known both Brooke and me since we were children. "Riley, dear, how wonderful to hear from you," she said when I identified myself. I was just thinking about you the other day when I saw that fundraising thing your family posted online. My heart sank. If Mrs. Garcia had seen the GoFundMe, it meant the story had spread throughout our old neighborhood, reaching people who'd known me growing up and would remember me as the responsible older sister who'd always seemed to have her life together. Mrs. Garcia, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. When my family talks about me, what do they say? There was a long pause, and I could hear her moving around her kitchen, probably settling in for a conversation she'd been expecting for years. Oh, honey, she said finally, I've been wondering when you were going to ask that question. What do you mean? Riley, I've known your family for 20 years, and I've watched how they talk about you versus how they talk about Brooke. It's always troubled me, but it wasn't my place to say anything. Can you give me specific examples? Well, for instance, when you graduated from college, your mother mentioned it once in passing. When Brooke graduated, she organized a neighborhood barbecue to celebrate and spent weeks talking about Brooke's prospects and opportunities. Mrs. Garcia continued, her voice growing more confident as she shared observations she'd apparently been storing for years. When you got married, I found out about it 3 months later when I asked Linda how you were doing. She mentioned that you'd gotten married to someone in the military and moved to Virginia. That was it. No details, no excitement, just a factual update. And when Brooke moved to Los Angeles? Your mother talked about it for months. She researched the neighborhood Brooke was moving to, learned about the entertainment industry, started following casting directors on social media. She treated it like Brooke was launching a space mission rather than moving to a new city. Mrs. Garcia, have they ever mentioned Marcus's job specifically? His rank or position? Not that I recall. Linda usually just says you married someone in the military and you're doing fine. But Riley, here's what really concerns me. About 6 months ago, Linda was telling me about how worried she was about you, how you never called anymore, and seemed to be struggling with something. My grip tightened on the phone. What did she say exactly? She said you'd become very distant, that you never shared details about your life anymore, and that she was worried you might be having marital problems or financial difficulties. She said Brooke was concerned too, that you seemed different when you talked on the phone. Did she mention any specific evidence for these concerns? That's what struck me as odd. When I asked for details, she couldn't really provide any. It was more like she'd decided something was wrong and then interpreted your behavior through that lens. Mrs. Garcia's observations confirmed what I'd been beginning to suspect. Somewhere along the way, my family had created an alternative version of my life that served their emotional needs better than the reality. In their version, I was struggling, distant, possibly failing in ways that justified their lack of investment in my actual circumstances. Mrs. Garcia, one more question. Have you ever seen them celebrate any of my achievements? Anything at all? She was quiet for a long moment. Honey, I don't think they see your achievements as achievements. I think they see them as things that happened to you, rather than things you accomplished. After we hung up, I sat in my home office surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that was far more elaborate and long-standing than I'd initially realized. This wasn't about a single GoFundMe campaign or a few intercepted emails. This was about years of systematic effort to control the narrative about my life, to prevent me from accessing opportunities that might elevate my status beyond what they considered appropriate. The pattern was clear and deliberate. Every time I'd achieved something significant, they'd found ways to minimize it or prevent others from recognizing it. Every time opportunities had come my way, they'd interfered to ensure those opportunities didn't reach me. Every time I tried to share good news or positive developments, they'd redirected the conversation back to Brooke, or expressed concerns about problems that existed only in their imagination. They'd essentially been conducting a years-long campaign to keep me in a box labeled, "Struggling Older Sister Who Needs Guidance and Support." When reality refused to cooperate with that narrative, they'd actively worked to reshape reality rather than adjusting their perception. But the most devastating discovery was still to come. That evening, while organizing the documentation I'd gathered, I found a folder on my computer that I'd forgotten about. It contained scanned copies of letters and cards that Marcus and I had sent to my family over the years. Things I'd saved as digital backups in case the originals were lost. Reading through them with fresh eyes, I saw a different story than the one I'd remembered. In letter after letter, card after card, I'd shared news about promotions, achievements, travel, professional recognition, and personal milestones. I'd included photos of our home, details about Marcus's career progression, descriptions of the work I was doing and the impact it was having. The letters painted a comprehensive picture of a life that was not only stable and successful, but genuinely fulfilling and meaningful. I'd been more generous with information than I'd remembered, more open about our circumstances, more willing to share good news despite their apparent lack of interest. Which meant they'd known everything. They'd known about Marcus's rank and position. They'd known about our home and financial stability. They'd known about my professional achievements and the recognition I'd been receiving in my field. They'd known all of it, and they'd chosen to ignore it completely while creating and maintaining a fictional narrative that painted me as someone who needed rescue and support. The GoFundMe campaign wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake based on outdated information. It was the culmination of a years-long effort to force reality to match their preferred version of who I was supposed to be. And, tomorrow, I was going to have to decide what to do about it. The first sign that my family had realized they'd made a catastrophic mistake came at 6 a.m, 3 days after I discovered the extent of their interference. My phone rang with an urgency that cut through the pre-dawn quiet of our Arlington home. Frank's name appeared on the screen, and something about the early hour told me this wasn't a casual check-in call. "Riley, we need to talk." His voice carried a tension I'd rarely heard from my father, who typically let Linda handle all family communications while he remained safely in the background. "About what, specifically?" I asked, though we both knew exactly what this conversation was about. About the situation that's gotten out of hand. About misunderstandings that need to be cleared up before they cause real damage. I almost laughed at his choice of words. Misunderstandings. As if years of systematic interference with my personal and professional life could be chalked up to simple miscommunication. "What kind of damage are you concerned about, Dad?" There was a pause and I could hear muffled voices in the background. Linda was coaching him through this call, probably standing right beside him with talking points written on a notepad. "Riley, some people have been asking questions about that fundraising page. People who know. People who are aware of your actual circumstances." "What kind of people?" "Well, Mrs. Chen from the bank called your mother yesterday. Apparently her son works for some government contractor in Washington, and he saw the GoFundMe. He was confused about why we were raising money for someone whose husband works at the Pentagon." The first crack in their carefully constructed narrative. I wondered how many other people in their social circle were beginning to connect the dots between the struggling daughter they'd portrayed and the reality of my life that was slowly coming to light. "And what did Mom tell Mrs. Chen?" She explained that there had been some confusion, that maybe the campaign wasn't as clear as it should have been about your situation. "Confusion about what exactly?" Frank's frustration was becoming audible. "Riley, you're not making this easy. We're trying to fix this quietly, without making a big scene that embarrasses everyone involved." "Fix what, Dad?" "Fix the fact that you created a public fundraising campaign based on completely false information. Fix the fact that you've been intercepting my mail and declining professional opportunities on my behalf for years. Fix the fact that you've been systematically lying to your friends and neighbors about my life circumstances." The silence that followed was longer and heavier than any pause in our previous conversations. When Frank finally spoke, his voice had changed, becoming smaller and more defensive. "We never meant for things to get this complicated." "What did you mean then? What was the intended outcome when you decided to tell hundreds of strangers that I was struggling financially and needed their charity?" We thought maybe if people could see that you needed support, you might be more willing to accept help from family." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had finally been extinguished. They hadn't created the GoFundMe to help me. They'd created it to manipulate me into a relationship dynamic where I would be dependent on their assistance and therefore more willing to play the role they'd assigned me in their family narrative. "Help with what?" I asked quietly. "With figuring out what you really want to do with your life. With finding direction that makes sense for someone with your capabilities." The careful word choice told me everything I needed to know. In their estimation, my current life, my career, my marriage, all of it was beyond what someone with my capabilities should reasonably have achieved. Rather than adjusting their assessment of my capabilities based on evidence of my success, they decided that my success must be temporary, unstable, or somehow illegitimate. Dad, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Do you know what Marcus's job title is? He works at the Pentagon. That's not a job title. That's a location. Do you know his rank? Silence. Do you know what department he runs? More silence. Do you know how much money I made last year? Riley, we don't need to know every detail of your financial situation to care about your well-being. But you need to know enough details to determine whether I require $25,000 in crowd-funded assistance for basic living expenses. The logic was unassailable, and we both knew it. They'd made detailed claims about my financial circumstances without having any actual information about my financial circumstances. They'd published those claims to hundreds of people and solicited money based on assertions they'd never bothered to verify. Frank, let me talk to her. Linda's voice came from the background, and I heard the phone being passed between them. Riley, honey, I think you're getting too upset about something that was done out of love. The word love landed like a physical blow. After everything I'd discovered about their years of interference and manipulation, after documenting their systematic efforts to control the narrative about my life, she was still framing this as an act of caring rather than an act of sabotage. Mom, love doesn't create fake fundraising campaigns. Love doesn't intercept mail and decline professional opportunities without permission. Love doesn't spend years telling people that your daughter is struggling when you have clear evidence that she's succeeding. We never said you were struggling in the way you're describing. You created a GoFundMe claiming I needed money for basic living expenses after a series of job losses and financial setbacks. How is that not describing me as struggling? We said you were going through a difficult time and could use some support. The hair splitting was maddening. She was trying to create semantic distinctions that would allow her to maintain the fiction that their intentions had been pure, while acknowledging none of the actual damage they'd caused. Mom, I'm married to a Pentagon colonel. We live in a house worth more than most people make in 5 years. I run a successful consulting firm that works with government agencies. In what universe does that constitute needing crowd-funded assistance? Money isn't everything, Riley. Sometimes people need emotional support and community connection more than they need financial help. Then why didn't you create a campaign asking for emotional support and community connection? Why did you specifically ask for money to help me get back on my feet? Linda was quiet for a moment, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Maybe the wording wasn't as precise as it should have been. The wording was extremely precise. It was also completely false. Riley, I think you're losing sight of the bigger picture here. Family relationships are more important than perfect communication about every detail. This isn't about perfect communication. This is about deliberate misrepresentation that has potentially damaged my professional reputation and created security concerns for my husband's career. What kind of security concerns? The question revealed just how little they understood about the implications of their actions. Military spouses undergo background checks and security clearances reviews. Having a family member who appears to be financially unstable or involved in public controversies can raise red flags that affect an officer's career prospects and access to classified information. Mom, when someone at Marcus's level has a spouse who becomes the subject of a public fundraising campaign, it raises questions about financial stability, family dynamics, and potential security risks. The Pentagon takes these things very seriously. Well, surely they would understand that it was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that's been documented on the internet with hundreds of donors and dozens of sympathetic comments. A misunderstanding that portrays me as someone who's had multiple job losses and financial setbacks. A misunderstanding that suggests I'm too proud to ask for help myself, which raises questions about my honesty and communication skills. For the first time in the conversation, Linda seemed to grasp the scope of what they'd set in motion. Military families lived under different rules and expectations than civilian families. What might be dismissed as family drama in other contexts could have serious professional consequences in the military world. What can we do to fix this? She asked finally. You can start by taking down the GoFundMe immediately and returning all the money that's been donated. But people have already contributed. They'll want to know why we're suddenly canceling it. You'll have to explain that the campaign was based on incorrect information about my circumstances. That will make us look like we don't know anything about our own daughter's life. Don't you think that's an accurate assessment? The question hung between us like a challenge she couldn't meet. Because the truth was that they didn't know anything about my life. By choice, rather than circumstance. They'd actively avoided learning about my circumstances, because those circumstances didn't fit the narrative they preferred to maintain. Riley, we're trying to be reasonable here, but you're not giving us much to work with. I'm not giving you much to work with. You created this problem. You spread false information about me to hundreds of people. You damaged my reputation and potentially jeopardized my husband's career. And now you're upset that I'm not being more helpful in fixing the mess you made? We're your family. We deserve some benefit of the doubt about our intentions. You've been my family for 32 years, and in all that time, you've never once shown interest in understanding who I actually am, or what my life actually looks like. You've assigned me a role that serves your emotional needs, and when reality conflicts with that role, you've chosen to fight reality rather than adjust your expectations. Linda was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, smaller and more uncertain than I'd heard from her in years. What do you want us to do, Riley? I want you to acknowledge that you created a serious problem based on false information. I want you to take full responsibility for the damage you've caused. I want you to return the money and explain honestly why the campaign was inappropriate. And I want you to commit to never again representing my circumstances to other people without my explicit permission. And if we do all of that, can we move past this and get back to normal? The question revealed how little they understood about what normal had been for me. Normal had been accepting their dismissal, tolerating their indifference, pretending that their lack of interest in my life was just their way of showing love. Normal had been allowing them to treat me as a supporting character in their family story, while they celebrated Brooke as the star. Mom, normal wasn't working for me. Normal was you spending 30 minutes on every phone call, talking about Brooke's career, while spending 30 seconds asking about mine. Normal was you blocking opportunities that could have advanced my professional development. Normal was you creating fictional problems in my life to justify treating me like someone who needed guidance, rather than someone who'd built a successful independent life. We never meant to make you feel unimportant. Intent doesn't erase impact. And the impact of your choices has been to consistently diminish my achievements while amplifying my supposed shortcomings. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, circling around the same fundamental disconnect. They wanted to treat this as a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a few apologies and adjustments. I needed them to understand that this was the culmination of decades of systematic disregard that had finally crossed a line into public humiliation and professional damage. When we finally hung up, they'd agreed to take down the GoFundMe within 24 hours, but they'd made no commitments about returning donations or explaining the true circumstances to people who'd contributed. They'd offered apologies that felt more like negotiations than genuine acknowledgments of wrongdoing. That afternoon, I got a call that changed everything. Mrs. Webb, this is Tom Bradley from Channel 7 News in Portland. I'm working on a story about crowdfunding campaigns, and your family's GoFundMe page has come to our attention as part of a larger investigation we're doing into fundraising transparency. My stomach dropped. What kind of investigation? We've been looking into campaigns where the stated circumstances don't match the beneficiary's actual situation. Your campaign has been flagged by several viewers who recognized the disconnect between the description and your public information. What public information? Well, your husband's military service record is partially public, and your consulting firm is listed in several government contractor databases. When people started cross-referencing that information with the fundraising campaign, they noticed some inconsistencies. The nightmare was expanding beyond my family's social circle. Professional journalists were now investigating the false claims my family had made about my circumstances. And those investigations would become public record that could follow me and Marcus for years. Mr. Bradley, I need you to understand that I had no knowledge of this campaign before it was published. I never authorized it, and the information it contains about my circumstances is completely false. That's actually what makes this interesting from a news perspective. We're seeing more cases where family members create fundraising campaigns without consulting the supposed beneficiaries, and it's raising questions about accountability and verification processes. Are you planning to broadcast this story? We're still in the information gathering phase, but yes, this will likely be part of a larger segment about crowdfunding oversight. Would you be willing to speak on camera about your experience? The irony was bitter. After years of my family preventing me from accessing media opportunities that could have advanced my career, I was finally being offered television coverage for a story that could destroy my professional reputation. Can I have some time to consider that? Of course. But Mrs. Webb, you should know that this story is moving forward with or without your participation. We've already documented the campaign and the inconsistencies. Your perspective would help provide context, but it's not necessary for us to proceed. After we hung up, I immediately called Marcus. It's gone public, I told him. Channel 7 News in Portland is doing an investigation into crowdfunding transparency, and our situation is going to be featured. When? Within the next few days, probably. Riley, this changes everything. Once this becomes a news story, my security office is going to be all over it. I need to get ahead of this immediately. What does that mean? It means I'm going to have to brief my commanding officers about the situation before they see it on television. It means we're going to have to provide comprehensive documentation proving that the claims in the campaign are false. It means this is about to become an official matter rather than a private family issue. That evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was Brooke. Riley, what the hell is happening? Her voice carried a panic I'd never heard from her before. Mom said there might be news coverage about this fundraising thing? That people are asking questions and making it into some kind of scandal? It's not a scandal, Brooke. It's a news investigation into false fundraising claims. But this is going to make our whole family look terrible on television. It's going to make the family members who created false fundraising claims look terrible on television. Riley, you have to do something to stop this. You have to call them and explain that it was just a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate choice to publish false information about my circumstances. But we're family. We can't let this become a public thing that follows us around forever. Brooke, you keep saying we as if I was involved in creating this problem. I didn't make any choices that led to this situation. I didn't publish false information. I didn't solicit money under false pretenses. And I didn't ignore clear evidence about someone's actual circumstances in order to maintain a fictional narrative. So you're just going to let them destroy our family's reputation on television? Our family's reputation is being destroyed by our family's actions, not by media coverage of those actions. Brooke was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had taken on the wheedling tone she'd used as a child when she wanted something. Riley, if you fix this, if you find a way to make this go away quietly, I promise things will be different. I promise we'll pay more attention to your life and include you more in family decisions. Brooke, I don't want to be included more in family decisions. I want to be left alone to live my actual life without interference. But we're family. Family means we work together to solve problems. Family means respecting each other enough not to create problems like this in the first place. The conversation continued for another hour, with Brooke alternating between begging me to fix the situation and blaming me for allowing it to escalate. She seemed genuinely unable to understand that I wasn't responsible for managing the consequences of choices I hadn't made. When we hung up, I sat in my home office looking at the growing file of documentation I'd assembled over the past week. Evidence of years of interference, manipulation, and systematic efforts to control the narrative about my life. Evidence of false claims that had now attracted media attention and potentially jeopardized my husband's career. And then I made a decision that would change everything. I called Tom Bradley back. Mr. Bradley, this is Riley Webb. I've decided I would like to participate in your story. Excellent. When would be a good time to schedule an interview? How about tomorrow? And Mr. Bradley, I have documentation you're going to want to see. The morning of the television interview, I woke up to find that someone had donated $50 million to my family's GoFundMe campaign. The notification appeared on my phone at exactly 6 a.m., accompanied by a message that made my heart stop completely. The donor was listed as anonymous supporter, but the billing address was unmistakably ours. Colonel and Mrs. Marcus Webb, Arlington, Virginia. The donation message read simply, for Riley Webb, daughter of Linda and Frank Patterson, sister of Brooke Patterson, with love and respect for all her accomplishments, from someone who knows her true worth. I sat up in bed, staring at the screen as if it might change if I blinked hard enough. Marcus had already left for an early meeting at the Pentagon, which meant he'd done this in the pre-dawn darkness while I was still sleeping. $50 million. More money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, donated to a campaign that claimed I needed $25,000 for basic living expenses. The donation had pushed the campaign total to $50,008,047. The contrast was so stark, so deliberately absurd, that it transformed the entire narrative from a family misunderstanding into something that would be impossible to ignore or explain away. My phone rang immediately. Tom Bradley from Channel 7. Mrs. Webb, I assume you've seen the development in your family's fundraising campaign? I just saw it. Can you confirm that this donation came from your household? I can confirm that my husband and I did not authorize, create, or support the original campaign. But yes, the $50 million donation appears to have come from my husband using our correct legal names and address. Do you have any comment about why your husband would make such a substantial donation to a campaign claiming you need financial assistance? I almost laughed. I think the donation speaks for itself, don't you? Mrs. Webb, this has transformed your story into something much bigger than we initially planned to cover. A $50 million donation to a $25,000 campaign is going to attract national attention. He was right, of course. By the time I got out of the shower, my phone had 17 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. News outlets, journalists, and what appeared to be several government agencies were all trying to reach me for comment. But the most interesting call was from my mother. Riley, what has Marcus done? Linda's voice carried a hysteria I'd never heard from her before. The campaign page is showing $50 million. $50 million. People are calling us asking if this is real. Asking how we could possibly need this much money. Asking if we're running some kind of scam. It's real, Mom. Marcus donated $50 million to your campaign, using our full legal names and our Arlington address. But why would he do that? Probably because he wanted to make it absolutely clear to everyone who sees this campaign exactly who I'm married to and what our actual financial circumstances are. Riley, this is insane. We can't accept $50 million. People will think we're criminals or liars or con artists. Well, you did create a fundraising campaign based on completely false information and solicit money from people under false pretenses. What did you think would happen when the truth came out? We thought it would just go away quietly once we explained the misunderstanding. Mom, misunderstandings don't typically attract federal investigation. Fraud does. The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Because that's what this was, technically speaking. They'd made false representations to solicit money from the public. The fact that they'd done it out of misguided family dynamics, rather than criminal intent, didn't change the legal reality of what they'd accomplished. Are you saying we could go to jail? I'm saying you created a situation that has attracted the attention of journalists, federal agencies, and now the entire internet. Marcus's donation has made this story impossible to ignore. Can't you make him take the money back? Mom, he used our real names and address. He did that specifically to force you to deal with the reality of who I actually am and what my life actually looks like. Taking the money back would defeat the entire purpose. What purpose? What is he trying to accomplish? He's trying to make it impossible for you to continue pretending that I'm someone I'm not. Linda was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear voices in the background. Frank and Brooke were probably both there, all of them trying to figure out how to contain a situation that had spiraled completely beyond their control. Riley, we're your family. Surely there's some way to work this out privately. There's nothing private about a $50 million donation to a public fundraising campaign, Mom. This is going to be news whether we want it to be or not. Then what do you want us to do? I want you to tell the truth. All of it. I want you to explain to every journalist who calls that you created this campaign without my knowledge or consent. I want you to admit that the information about my circumstances was completely false. I want you to acknowledge that you've been interfering with my personal and professional life for years. And I want you to publicly apologize for the damage you've caused to my reputation and my husband's career. And if we do all of that, then maybe you can begin to understand why I've been so distant from this family for so long. After we hung up, I called Marcus at work. $50 million? I said when he answered. I figured if they were going to lie about your circumstances, we might as well make the lie impossible to maintain. Do you realize this is going to be national news? Good. Let them explain to the entire country why they thought the wife of a Pentagon colonel needed crowdfunded assistance for basic living expenses. Marcus, this could affect your career. Riley, they already affected my career when they created a security concern that required me to brief my commanding officers about my wife's supposed financial instability. At least now everyone will know exactly what the truth is. What did your superiors say when you told them about the donation? They said it was the most creative way they'd ever seen someone handle a false information campaign. That afternoon, I sat down with Tom Bradley for what had become the most important interview of my life. Instead of a brief segment about crowdfunding oversight, this had become a featured story about family dynamics, military life, and the power of social media to amplify both lies and truth. Mrs. Webb, can you walk us through how you discovered this campaign? I told the story methodically, starting with Chloe's screenshot and walking through each revelation about my family's years of interference with my life. Tom Bradley was a skilled interviewer, asking follow-up questions that allowed me to explain not just what had happened, but the pattern of behavior that had led to this moment. And you had no knowledge that your family was planning to create this fundraising campaign? None whatsoever. The first I heard about it was when my college roommate sent me a screenshot 3 days after it had been posted. What was your initial reaction when you saw it? Disbelief, followed by humiliation, followed by anger as I began to understand the scope of what they'd done. Can you describe your actual financial circumstances? My husband is a colonel in the United States Army and serves as Chief of Strategic Operations at the Pentagon. I run a successful government consulting firm specializing in veterans affairs and international relations. We live in a 4-bedroom townhouse in Arlington, Virginia, and our household income is in the high 6 figures. The idea that we would need crowdfunded assistance for basic living expenses is not just false, it's absurd. And your family was aware of these circumstances? I've been sending them letters and cards detailing our lives for 4 years. They attended our wedding. They have our address. The information was available to them if they'd chosen to pay attention to it. What do you think motivated them to create this campaign despite having access to accurate information about your life? This was the question I'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. Because answering it honestly meant acknowledging painful truths about family dynamics that most people preferred to keep private. I think they needed me to fit a certain role in their family narrative, and when my actual life didn't match that role, they chose to ignore reality rather than adjust their expectations. Can you elaborate on that? For my entire life, I've been the responsible older sister who was expected to need guidance and support. My younger sister has always been the star, the one with talent and potential and exciting prospects. When I built a successful independent life that didn't require their guidance or support, it disrupted the family dynamic they were comfortable with. So the campaign was less about helping you and more about reinforcing their perception of your role in the family? I believe so, yes. They needed me to be someone who struggled, someone who needed rescue, someone who fit their understanding of who I was supposed to be. And your husband's $50 million donation? My husband wanted to make it impossible for them to continue ignoring reality. When someone donates $50 million to a campaign claiming you need $25,000 for basic expenses, it becomes very difficult to maintain the fiction that you're struggling financially. What has the reaction been from your family since the donation was made public? Panic, primarily. They're beginning to understand that their choices have consequences they didn't anticipate. What would you say to other people who might be dealing with similar family dynamics? I thought carefully before answering, knowing that this response would probably be the most important part of the entire interview. I would say that you don't owe people access to your life just because they share your DNA. You don't owe people the right to control your narrative or interfere with your opportunities. And you don't owe people forgiveness for behavior they refuse to acknowledge or change. Even when those people are family? Especially when those people are family. Because family relationships should be based on love and respect, not on control and manipulation. The interview aired that evening during prime time, and within hours it had been picked up by national news networks. The story of the $50 million donation to a $25,000 campaign captured the public imagination in a way that none of us had anticipated. Social media exploded with commentary, memes, and analysis of the family dynamics on display. People shared their own stories of being misrepresented or controlled by family members. Military spouses talked about the unique pressures of maintaining professional reputations while dealing with family drama. Financial experts discussed the implications of donating such large amounts to expose fraudulent fundraising campaigns. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. 2 days after the interview aired, I received a phone call from Janet Morrison, the attorney I'd consulted about intellectual property issues months earlier. But this time, she wasn't calling about legal advice. "Riley, I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how you're going to react to this information." "What is it?" "Remember when we discussed documenting your grandmother's will and the intellectual property provisions? Well, I did some additional research into your family's financial situation, and I discovered something that I think you need to know about." "What kind of something?" "Your grandmother didn't just leave you intellectual property rights. She left you a substantial financial inheritance that was supposed to be distributed when you turned 30. My hands went cold. "What do you mean?" "Your grandmother established a trust fund with specific instructions that you were to receive the full inheritance on your 30th birthday, which was 2 years ago. The trust was worth approximately $12 million. I never received any inheritance. That's because the trust required notification through your parents, who were listed as secondary contacts in case you couldn't be reached directly. According to the records, they informed the trust administrators that you had declined the inheritance and requested that it remain in the trust indefinitely." The room seemed to tilt around me. "They told the trust administrators that I declined $12 million? They provided a signed document supposedly from you, declining the inheritance and requesting that it be held in trust for future distribution to other family members." "I never signed any such document." "I was afraid you were going to say that." The implications crashed over me like a tsunami. Not only had my family been interfering with my career opportunities and controlling the narrative about my life, they'd been stealing from me. They'd actively prevented me from receiving an inheritance that would have provided complete financial independence and eliminated any possibility that I might ever need their support or assistance. "Janet, what are the legal implications of this? If you can prove that you never signed that document, which shouldn't be difficult given that you were never contacted about the inheritance, then this constitutes fraud on a massive scale. We're talking about federal crimes, potential prison sentences, and certainly full restitution of the stolen funds, plus interest and penalties." And the GoFundMe campaign? The GoFundMe campaign just became evidence in a federal fraud case. They were soliciting money for someone they knew had been entitled to receive $12 million. They created a narrative of financial struggle while actively hiding assets that belonged to you. That evening, Marcus and I sat in our living room with the television on but the sound muted, watching news coverage of a story that had become bigger than either of us had imagined possible. The $50 million donation had transformed from a family drama into a national conversation about trust, truth, and the ways people manipulate narratives to serve their own needs. But more importantly, it had revealed information that would allow me to reclaim not just my reputation but resources that had been stolen from me years earlier. "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked. "I want justice. Not revenge, not punishment, but actual accountability for what they've done. That's going to mean federal charges, criminal prosecution, and probably years of legal proceedings. I know. It's also going to mean that your family relationships will never recover." "Marcus, those relationships died years ago. I just hadn't acknowledged it yet." The next morning, I called Tom Bradley to schedule a follow-up interview. This time, the story wouldn't just be about a fraudulent GoFundMe campaign. It would be about a decades-long pattern of financial fraud and identity theft that had been exposed by a $50 million donation. Within a week, federal investigators had frozen the trust account and begun examining the forged documents that had prevented me from receiving my inheritance. My family hired attorneys and began trying to negotiate plea agreements that would minimize their prison sentences. The GoFundMe platform suspended their account and began investigating other campaigns for similar fraud patterns. Brooke's social media presence, which had been her primary career focus, collapsed under the weight of the scandal. Linda and Frank's standing in their community evaporated as neighbors and friends learned the truth about their systematic deception. The carefully constructed narrative they'd maintained for decades crumbled completely under scrutiny that they'd brought upon themselves. But the most satisfying moment came 3 months later, when I received a check for $12 million plus accrued interest and penalties. The total amount was nearly $15 million. Money that had been mine by right for 2 years but had been stolen through forged documents and deliberate deception. I donated $10 million of it to veterans organizations and educational scholarships for military children, not because I needed the tax deduction or wanted public recognition, but because I wanted to use resources that had been hidden from me to help people who actually needed assistance. The remaining $5 million went into investments and savings that would ensure Marcus and I never had to worry about financial security again. Ironic, considering that my family had convinced themselves I needed their help to survive. 6 months after the story broke, I received a letter from Linda. Not an email, not a phone call, but an actual handwritten letter, delivered through the postal service to our Arlington address. The letter was 3 pages long, and for the first time in my adult life, it contained what appeared to be genuine acknowledgement of the harm they'd caused. She wrote about recognizing patterns of behavior that had been going on for decades, about understanding that their treatment of me had been unfair and destructive, about accepting responsibility for choices that had caused real damage to my life and career. She wrote about seeing me clearly for the first time, about being proud of what I'd accomplished, about regretting that it had taken such dramatic circumstances for them to understand who I actually was. The letter ended with an apology that felt real rather than strategic, and an acknowledgement that she didn't expect forgiveness or reconciliation. She simply wanted me to know that they finally understood what they'd done and why it had been wrong. I read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. Not because I was angry or vindictive, but because some relationships can't be repaired even with perfect apologies. Too much damage had been done over too many years for sorry to bridge the gap between who they'd needed me to be and who I actually was. A year later, Marcus and I moved to a larger home in a different neighborhood, one with no forwarding address shared with my family of origin. We hosted holidays for his parents and our chosen friends, creating traditions that belonged entirely to us. We traveled extensively, exploring countries and cultures that fascinated us without having to justify our choices to people who wouldn't understand them anyway. I expanded my consulting firm and began teaching graduate courses in international relations at a local university. Marcus continued his distinguished military career, eventually being promoted to brigadier general, with my enthusiastic support and celebration. We built a life that was exactly what we wanted it to be, without interference or manipulation, or attempts to force us into roles that didn't fit. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how everything happened, if I wish we'd found a way to resolve the situation quietly, without all the public attention and legal consequences. But I don't regret it at all. Because the truth, even when it's painful and complicated and messy, is always better than a lie that someone else wants you to live. My family needed me to be small, struggling, and dependent, so they could feel important and necessary in my life. When I refused to stay small, they tried to force me back into that box through manipulation, interference, and ultimately public humiliation. But Marcus's $50 million donation made it impossible for anyone to ignore the reality of who I actually was and what I'd actually accomplished. The money they thought I needed became proof that I'd never needed them at all. The campaign they created to help me became evidence of their own crimes. The story they told to make themselves feel better about neglecting me became the story that revealed their systematic deception to the entire world. In the end, their attempt to control my narrative gave me the platform to tell my own story in my own words. And that story wasn't about being a struggling sister who needed rescue. It was about being a successful woman who'd built an extraordinary life despite, rather than because of, her family's involvement. Sometimes the greatest gift people can give you is showing the world exactly who they really are. My family gave me that gift when they created a campaign that revealed their years of deception and manipulation. Marcus gave me an even greater gift when he made it impossible for anyone to ignore the truth about who I really was. And I gave myself the greatest gift of all when I finally stopped trying to earn love from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth their genuine attention or respect. The woman in that old college photo they'd used for the campaign really had been struggling, really had needed support and encouragement, really had deserved better treatment from the people who claimed to love her. But she'd grown into someone who no longer needed anyone's permission to take up space in the world, someone who no longer apologized for achieving more than others expected, someone who had learned that peace comes not from winning people over, but from walking away from people who will never see your worth. That's the story I tell now when people ask about the $50 million donation that made national news. Not a story about family drama or social media scandals, but a story about learning that you can't change people who benefit from misunderstanding you. You can only change how much access you give them to the life you're building without their input or approval. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.